Okay, so moving on to our next speaker, we will have Helen, and she's going to tell us a little bit about her master's project. So I'm sure we're very intrigued to hear about that. So I will pass you all on to Helen, and I'm looking forward to it.
Great, thank you, Tony. So hello everyone. Thanks very much for having me today. It's really great to be here. So first, a little bit about me. My name's Helen Campbell, and I'm just finishing up my final year in doing an MSc at Cardiff University in genetic and genomic counselling. And I also work part-time for the RNIB as an eye care liaison officer, or an ACLO in an ophthalmology department in Chester. But today I'm very much speaking to you with my sort of MSc hat on, and I'm talking to you about my final year dissertation, which is a piece of research that I've done in partnership with Aniridia Network over the last year or so as part of my MSc. This next slide shows an outline of my presentation. So I'll first be telling you a bit about the research topic that I'm looking into. Then I'll be talking to you about the methodology that I used. The majority of the presentation will be about my key findings. And then finally, a bit of a summary and some sort of recommendations as well. The research topic that I chose, with some help from the trustees of Aniridia Network and the formulation of it, is what is the psychosocial impact of further sight loss in adulthood in people with sporadic and familial cases of aniridia? So I just wanted to break that down a little bit. So what is the psychosocial impact? Psychosocial is a sort of word that's basically made up of psychological, so thinking about things like sort of emotions and mental health and experiences, and then also the social at the end, so things like relationships, employment, social life, family, and things like that. And then, yeah, one of the things I was particularly interested in was sort of comparing the experiences of people with sporadic and familial aniridia to see if there was sort of any difference. So people with sporadic aniridia, it's the sort of the first time in the family that the aniridia has cropped up and they haven't inherited it from a parent. Whereas familial aniridia is when someone has a parent with the condition and they've inherited it from them. So the methodology that I used, I recruited with the kind help of the Aniridia Network, using sort of social media and their newsletter channels, Facebook groups and things like that. And then consent was taken via an online consent form. And then after that, I corresponded with the individual and we set up a interview via Zoom, which was recorded and was sort of one-to-one. The average length of the interview was 57 minutes, so quite a lot of time to get into lots of detail. And then after that, I transcribed those interviews and applied a thematic analysis approach to it, which is basically having a look at the transcripts, picking out different codes, and then using those to gather different themes up to see what the themes were of all the data that I'd collected. So the next few slides have some information about the demographics of the participant that ultimately took part. So I had 13 participants in general, and on the left-hand side of the slide, there's a chart that shows the gender of the participants. So I had 8 female participants and 5 male participants. And then on the right-hand side, there's the type of aniridia that the participants had. So 7 participants had sporadic aniridia and 6 participants had familial aniridia. So I was quite happy with that spread, actually. That was one of the concerns, was that everyone would have one and fewer participants would have the other, but it was quite a nice balance in that sense. And then the next slide shows the age category of the 13 participants. So there were 8 who were aged 40 to 59, and 3 who were aged 25 to 39, and 2 who were aged 60 to 79. So I didn't recruit anyone who was 24 and under or 80 and over. So slightly missing the experiences of those 2 age groups. But other than that, again, a relatively good spread, really. So after analysing all of the interviews, I came up with 3 key themes that related to the psychosocial impact of deteriorating vision directly. And these were constant adaptation, anxiety, and a changing relationship with the outside world. And then the final key theme was support, and that related to how individuals coped with their changing sight. So each of these four themes also had sub-themes related to them. And I'm now going to go through each one in turn and each sub-theme with some quotes added in from the participants just to sort of illustrate the findings a little bit. So this next slide shows the four sub-themes that were related to theme one, which was constant adaptation. And there's a bit of a cycle in the middle of the slide, which says first changing capacity, which leads to a psychological toll, which leads to trial and error. And that those are sort of in a bit of a cycle shape. And then finally, there's a sense of a challenge to independence underneath that. So this first sub-theme was a change in capacity, and that relates to the fact that the majority of participants, when I was talking to them about how they experienced their deteriorating sight, they often described it in terms of the limits that it had had on their capacity and their ability to do certain things. So there's quite a good quote on this slide which illustrates this from participant 7. With all the quotes, I'll make sure I'm reading them out verbatim as well, so don't worry too much about reading them. So the quote from participant 7 says, so it's things like, I can't see as I did to be able to say, even just pour a drink. I have less confidence to go somewhere because I might miss the door because I can't see doorways anymore. So that shows the sort of range of different things that people might have issues with when they're sort of noticing the decline in their sight. And then leading on from this was sub-theme number 2, which relates to the psychological toll. So participants really sometimes felt that the changing capacity brought about a kind of psychological toll because they were no longer able to do things that they were able to do previously. So, for example, participant 10 talks about in the first quote, but to be honest, with a certain point, I felt, sort of helpless because of my eye condition, that it deteriorated that much. I couldn't help that much. And then participant 13 talks about, I think I've probably experienced something like a grieving process through losing my vision. So you get a real sense there for the way that different people, different participants sort of explained and made sense of the change in their sight. The next sub-theme is trial and error, and that refers to the way that participants discuss the practical adaptation to their changing capacity. So aids and adaptations, and we've sort of heard about some of these in Gail's presentation as well, things like assistive technology, magnifiers, mobility aids, use of hats and sunglasses, and changing lighting levels in domestic or work environments were all mentioned as practical methods of adapting to further sight loss. And one thing that came out quite strongly from a few participants was, although these were all really useful strategies, the actual process of finding out about them and then actually testing them out and then working out how to adopt them in day-to-day life was in and of itself quite a challenging process for some participants, and again really took a toll because different things worked well at different times of the day according to even what time of the year it was. So even that in and of itself could be challenging for people. And then finally, the last sub-theme in this first theme, sorry, there's a lot of themes in this presentation, is challenge to independence. And many of the participants identified as being sort of fiercely independent and were very resilient. And their change in sight brought about a bit of a challenge to this. There was sometimes this sort of bit of a paradoxical relationship between support and independence. So participants felt that sometimes they had to admit that they needed help, which made them feel less independent, but then after that then provoked them to seek support, they would then end up increasing their independence. So there was an interesting relationship there. And there's a couple of quotes on this slide that illustrate that idea. So participant 11 says, with the right help in place, you can still kind of do X, Y, Z. And participant number 3 says, so over the years, it's getting that balance right. That, you want to be independent, but there's independence and then there's stubbornness. So overall, the first theme of constant adaptation really shows how people's changing vision and like the adaptations to that and how that intersects with their own independence can really take a psychological toll on people with aniridia. So the next theme was around anxiety, and there were two sub-themes within this. So the first sub-theme was future sight loss is unknown. So fear and anxiety around future sight loss, the extent and timing of it, and the impact it might have on various aspects of people's lives, such as caring for family members or work and social activities. This could be quite a big thing for some individuals, as shown by the quote from participant 11 on the slide. He says, "So that was a big thing that I kind of had to adjust to. The future at some point will be that I have very limited sight, and I don't know how long that would be. No one can tell me. I don't know whether it's going to be 5 years or 20 years. So that was a bit hard to kind of sort of get your head around. So yeah, that really highlights this sort of having to deal with this sort of daily uncertainty of what your sight might be doing in the future. And a really important coping mechanism for people around this was being really proactive about researching future sources of support and future proofing various things in their life. So being aware of contact details of agencies that might help, staying on top of new developments, maybe learning different skills in advance of having to need them so that people could feel a little bit more in control of that process. And then the second sub theme under anxiety was that treatment is worrying. And interesting, this was a bit of a difference between people with sporadic and familial aniridia. So people with familial aniridia may have had family members, especially a sort of older generation, who'd had poor treatment experiences and were therefore potentially more anxious about treatment. So the first quote on the slide speaks to this. It says, "As I say, I might not be so fearful of the operation that will be coming up at some point if hers hadn't have gone so wrong." And that was someone referring to an operation that their mum had had. And then some participants waited for as long as possible before they got surgery, as illustrated by the second quote on the slide, which says, "I was terrified of the surgery until it got to the point where it was so bad in my right eye, it was useless anyway. So I thought I may as well do it. And then it improved the sight in that eye a lot, which is when I got the other one done." So there was also a bit of a sense of a sort of postcode lottery around this as well. So there were a number of participants who unfortunately mentioned some sort of poor healthcare experiences, but these very much depended on the particular clinic or doctor that participants came into contact with, and was no means by universal, as some other participants who mentioned very positive experiences. But it does show that there is some sort of differences between who people's care provider is and therefore what they're experiencing. So theme number 3, this is the third one of the big key themes, was a changing relationship with the outside world. Owing to the time constraints, I'm not going to go through each of these sub-themes in particular with quotes one by one, but just to sort of speak briefly on them. So the first sub-theme was going out. For some participants, going out and about, they found it more difficult to go to, especially unfamiliar environments and especially by themselves. And this was made worse by inaccessible environments in society, such as, some supermarkets and other environments, which might be more difficult for people in terms of layout or emphasis on self-service checkout. So that was very much a sort of emphasis on inaccessibility of certain environments in society. And then secondly, participants mentioned that they did generally become more reliant on others when they were out and about. So this is the second sub-theme, which is relying on others. So for some participants, it came very naturally to approach others and be very open about asking for help and support. And for others, they had to sort of force themselves out of their comfort zone. But it would often become easier the more they did it. And then the final sub-theme was relating to work. And people reported that their changing eyesight did affect their jobs. And one really important factor as to whether people were able to continue working or not was flexibility of employers, which shows the importance of that for many people. And then the fourth key theme was about support, which within it had 4 sub-themes. Hope you're bearing with all these themes. So the first sub-theme was no one to guide me. And this relates to one topic which most participants brought up, which was most different for people with sporadic aniridia and people with familial aniridia. And both groups of participants agreed that it was more difficult for people with sporadic aniridia to really find out about and access support, because you don't know what you don't know. And if you're the first member of your family with the condition, then it's already much more difficult for you to find out about these things. So there's two contrasting quotes on the slide which illustrate this. The first one's from participant 11, who had sporadic aniridia. He said, so you're kind of going through this sight loss, but no one is helping you navigate it. And then the other quote is from participant 8, who's got familial aniridia, who says, you're native to that experience. And I think it does make life a lot easier in terms of navigating sight loss. So I think that sort of metaphor of feeling native and sort of navigating, you've got the map, you've got the compass, you're really prepared for navigating this world, is a really interesting metaphor when we're thinking about the differences for people's experience of navigating support ultimately. The second sub-theme is families are complex. So while, as I've just mentioned, families can provide really useful guides to available support if there's already someone in the family with an eye condition or aniridia. Also on the positive side, participants said that they would provide direct support as well. And partners, siblings, and parents were very much available for emotional or practical support when participants needed a hand, which is exemplified by the quote on the slide from participant 7. He said, I rely on my partner. He's got a vision impairment himself, but he's got very, very good vision though. So I rely on him, well, quite a lot really, to help me out doing bits and bobs, even if it's just like finding the towel or something, whatever it is. However, families were not always necessarily a straightforward source of support for participants, especially on this sort of emotional side of things. There were some challenges, such as sort of not being able to really openly express emotions to loved ones because you're wanting to protect them. And I think that kind of shows the importance of emotional support outside of a family environment as well. And we'll be talking about mental health support a bit later on. The third sub-theme under support was the VI community, and many participants felt that their most useful source of support when they were experiencing deteriorating sight was from the VI community itself. And people often talked about how important it was that it was in a sort of informal or peer group sense, rather than a kind of taught session, a really sort of structured session. It was more important to be in this sort of milieu and in knowing other people with a VI and having that informal network. So participant 11 talks about this with the quote on the slide, which says, it began to kind of sort of give me a bit of knowledge and understanding that there are other people out there kind of sort of like me. And actually my challenges are quite normal if you have aniridia. So I think this sub-theme shows the importance of events like this one really, and community-led support groups in this space like Aniridia Network and other patient support groups in terms of providing those networks for people. And then the final sub-theme of the support theme was inadequate support. And this was regarding frustrations that some participants had with, support that was inadequate in some ways. So firstly, there were sort of two types of support that were viewed as particularly inadequate. So the first one was around accessing financial support that participants are entitled to, like PIP and things like that. And people often had quite negative experiences of accessing this and having to go through the process of applying for this. And participant 1 mentions this in the quote on the slide. He says, don't really feel like there is actually much out there to help. Although there are some benefits, they seem to make them really hard to get hold of. And it's an effort enough going through the interview and saying all of the embarrassing things that you have to say. And then secondly, whilst many participants felt they would likely benefit from more structured mental health support as they were adjusting to deteriorating vision and things like that, they often either did not have access to it, or when they did, it was in inadequate structure. So it was very limited number of sessions, or it was using an approach that wasn't particularly helpful, or sometimes the counsellor was not well trained in awareness of VI issues or didn't have any sort of lived experience themselves. So they weren't able to provide the kind of support that people really needed. So I know that's been quite a lot of information there to go through quite quickly. So I wanted to give a little bit of a summary, really. So the first thing is that further sight loss can be associated with constant adaptation and that sort of psychological challenge of adjustment. And then secondly, anxiety, especially about the future and especially about any sort of further treatment options. And this is supported by other research in the broader context of the impact of deteriorating vision as well. There are some coping strategies that participants use to deal with this further sight loss, including the idea of future proofing and thinking about skills and equipment and knowledge that they needed to help them cope with any sight loss they had in the future. The second one was this sort of personal resourcefulness and resilience. And then next was the support from family, friends, and the VI community. However, other support could be better. And the key differences between people with sporadic and familial aniridia were firstly, the sort of availability and access to knowledge and awareness about available support. And secondly, expectations about treatment, depending on the sort of familial experiences that were present. So some recommendations then as a result of this research. So the first thing is better information about what support's available, and that's especially necessary for people with sporadic aniridia. And ideally it should be available at multiple points, so potentially at the diagnosis point, but also whenever that person comes back into contact with healthcare providers and people like ACLOS and other people in that sort of ophthalmology environment. It would be really good for them to think more carefully about that. Potentially improving some ophthalmology care, especially around being sensitive that people with aniridia may be particularly nervous about further treatment, being more transparent about uncertainties and empathy as well. And then better availability and quality of mental health support with counsellors who have experience of or are trained in visual awareness. I think that would be really important. I wanted to say some thank yous as well. So thank you so much to all of the participants of the research. Everyone was really open, warm and patient in all of the interviews. So I really, really appreciate all of your time. Also, thank you to the trustees of Aniridia Network and to my supervisor, Professor Marion McAllister. All right, any questions?
Thank you so much, Helen. That was really, really interesting, especially seeing the difference between the familial group and the sporadic group. I don't think it really recognized with me how different it can be with your experience growing up. We have a few questions in the chat for you. So, first person has asked, what made you decide on the interview process? Because it's quite an intense process going through all of that, having the individual one by ones over maybe something like getting questionnaires.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I thought the type of the question that I had was sort of really getting to grips with people's sort of experience of that their change in vision. And I felt that a sort of qualitative approach, so asking questions, would enable me to really get to the bottom of those sort of experiences in a very sort of personalized level. So although you can have questionnaires and they enable comparability and things like that, you can't necessarily really get to the heart of people's experiences. So that was why I chose to go with the sort of qualitative interview approach. But there's a lot of space for sort of questionnaires and those more structured approaches, I think, especially coming from this kind of research, in the future.
Great. Yeah, I mean, there's pros and cons to everything, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the next question we got in the chat, I've got one sent directly to me, which was, do you, Helen, have any suggestions of what areas the community should be investigating further to see how people with aniridia could be better supported?
I think there's a real sort of importance about availability of information. That was sort of definitely one of the findings. I should say there's quite a long bit in my dissertation about the sort of strengths and limitations of this research, which I haven't gone into. I'm happy to go into great detail about, but definitely one of the limitations is because I used Aniridia Network to recruit. There's a bit of a sample bias in that I was only able to sort of speak to people who were already tapped into those sorts of networks. So it's hard to know sort of what the experiences of people who aren't currently tapped into patient support groups like Aniridia Network might be. But certainly even sort of talking to the participants in my research, it was clear that availability of information was really, really important, and that there's, there are things like sort of low vision services, and other things like sort of rehabilitation officers who do a really good job, but a lot of them are very overstretched, and almost having sort of continuous points of contact with individuals like that who can provide much more information about support, I think would be really, really helpful. And definitely mental health support came out very strongly as well.
More work needed as always.
Yeah.
And then we got another question here. They've noted that your talk was really interesting, so thank you so much for all your work. That you've mentioned a lot about support, and one of the three concerns for the study group was work. Do you know of any groups or organizations that help with finding opportunities for people with aniridia or visual impairments in general?
I guess that would be in a sort of support environment, in an employment environment, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in terms of employment, there are the RNIB does have some sort of availability of kind of internships and things. I think the Thomas Pocklington Trust also has a lot of really good resources about employment for people with different types of vision impairment, including aniridia. But yeah, I think there is definitely resources out there, and certainly once you're in work, there are sort of government programs like Access to Work, which exist to try and help provide support for people who are in employment. But yeah, definitely one of the findings was that employer flexibility was really important and should be emphasised to any employers.
Great. Thank you so much, Helen. That was really interesting.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.